Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Good morning, good evening, good day. It is Nikos RPG and the Game Master's Guide. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host, and we have a lighting problem, so I'm going to fix that really quickly. Alrighty, we'll try that again. Take two. Welcome to Nikos RPG. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host. This is Game Master's Guide, and tonight we have a full show for you. So just as we did earlier this morning, we're going to have this in a digest format. It seems to be able to get the information out more quickly and in smaller bite-sized pieces to make it easier for you to follow along with what we're talking about. And today we're going to be talking a lot about the issues that we have in a role-playing games group week over week, that they're problems, they're challenges, but they're not overcomable. They're not something that is going to break the games at your table, but these are some tips and techniques and skills that you can develop to make your game sessions better. So we're going to talk about the rule of threes. And the rule of threes is one of the mechanisms I've developed to handle many of the problems that occur in a role-playing game. From the standpoint of resolving the conflicts, interplayer, player versus game master, and players versus player, the mechanisms that come up that are problematic take a lot of different forms, and generally we have to figure out some way of resolving them in a short order to make sure that we can continue playing without interfering with whether or not somebody is having a personal conflict with another person, whether they have a problem with you as a storyteller or you have a problem with something that they're doing. And utilizing the rule of threes is sort of a mechanism that handles that. By the rule of threes, I'm referring to any conversational point for which a player will argue not once, not twice, but three times for it. There is something behind that argumentative point that needs to be resolved. There is something that they hold seriously. We generally, if we have a position that is perhaps tenuous or something that we don't necessarily feel strongly about, we'll argue the point once. Perhaps we'll make a rebuttal, but generally it will be dropped after that because it's not worth the difficulty. On the other hand, if something is worth putting your foot up into the conversation, put your toe in the water, so to speak, then and you're able to stick with it more than twice, then there's something important. So I utilize the rule of threes. Now, this is not always a hard and fast rule. Obviously, this is a guideline or perhaps a issue of protocol. But I generally use three before I actually, if you will, put my foot down and require a change. So the rule of three would go something like this. If someone, for example, in a particular day is talking over other players on a regular and continuing basis, I will draw their attention to it once. I'll say, hey, we need to not talk over each other. Then we start to play again, and there's another interaction, and they step on somebody else again. Second time, I will clarify, this person is the challenge. We need to resolve this because it's not fair for the other players, whatever the argument would be, and go back to playing again. If the third time happens, then I actually will take that person and remove them from the play area, have a conversation with them one-on-one, and stipulate that this has to change immediately, and I'm not, this is something that is immutable, that it has to happen, and what the justification is. Now, this goes the reverse as well. If a player has a problem with me, they have permission to call me out on my as other people would say, call me out on my problems, call me out on my issues, and rightly so. And again, they can draw attention to it for me so that I can fix it. And ultimately, this mechanism works really well because you're not overburdening the situation. You're letting the social pressures of the situation filter through because you're giving the player more than one option in the face of all the other players at the table. But you're also taking it private when it needs to be addressed and resolving it in that fashion. Generally, I've had no problems with this on the long term, and there are a couple of precise examples I could give, but I'm not going to because that actually would be disparaging the individual. But the idea that the rule of three helps to resolve things also does other elemental things. For example, the rule of three might apply if I've given a description the players aren't comprehending, the terminology I'm using may not be appropriate or may not be understood properly. So then, therefore, I will restate it with different terminology to try to make it more clear. And on the third attempt, if I can't, I will resolve the situation by asking them what they perceive and then working what I'm trying to develop into the scene from that angle, utilizing what they're seeing rather than overburdening the fact that they didn't get where I was going. And that's, again, perfectly okay. It's a role-play game, and we can simply adjust and adapt the mechanics of the story to fit our purposes. The final place that the rule of three comes in is in the situation of combat. Now, this may feel a little bit contrived, but the reality is that the mechanics of a fight scene are such that the players and the creatures or monsters that they're engaged with should fundamentally have a sticking point at some point in the scene to either convey new information or change the mechanism. And I utilize basically a three-strike process, if you will, to ensure that happens. That is to say, if the players succeed and my monsters have failed, the first time it enrages my monster and makes it more dangerous. The second time they successfully hit it, it's weakened to the point of now desperation and irrationality. And then the third time that they've succeeded and I failed, they have defeated the monster. And this concept of three stages really plays into the dynamics of a role-playing game because the players can actually push forward, succeed in changing the status to make the monster enraged. The monster can then press back and put the players on their back feet, and it goes back and forth dynamically. And as long as the rule of three is applied, it's basically three victories in a row and the fight's over. And it can be less than that if the monster is simple. If it's more complex, of course, there's more dynamics and details you can add. One way is to have particular conditions that only trigger when the fight has gotten to a certain stage. So that, for example, in the case of you've got a monster that is now in an enraged state, it won't move on beyond that enraged state until the players have actually dealt damage to it. So that's a matter of their decision. They certainly could keep pushing the conditions, but therefore keeping the monster in that enraged state for longer, while it may be dealing damage to them directly and trying to harm them. And it's a matter of the players determining when that point is, when they change their tactics, and therefore that changes the dynamics of the fight scene and makes the game feel more dynamic, and of course more player agency is employed in such a fashion. So we also need to talk about the concept of Monster in a Minute. This is a new thing that I've added, and this would be my second attempt at it. My first attempt earlier today failed to accomplish the 60-second rule, and so it will be made into a video separately. We'll actually cut the piece down to try to get it to fit into the 1 minute, but in this case we're going to attempt again to establish a 1 minute video. And a Monster in a Minute is something that we can do in the realm of the Nikos RPG mechanism, simply because the creation of a monster depends on choosing three monstrous elements from the monster creation form and building out the rest of the character and the rest of the persona or the rest of the entity in the same way you would build a persona. So you're creating the base numbers for it as well. So we're assuming that in this case we've already built the base numbers, and so we're going to start with the description of the monster in a minute and work as quickly as we can to accomplish that. So in this case, we are going to be building in particular something known as the Walking Drowned. They are a mortal being in essence. They have they're bipedal, semi-sentient, as most people are, and have in particular 3 of the marks of the monsters. The first one is that they have water breathing, so they can live in the water environment as well as on the surface. The second of their marks is concept of undying, and that is that they are not a creature who ultimately is destroyed by the actual wounds, but rather are only depleted by knocking out their fatigue and causing them to be unable to continue moving, and so therefore it takes energetic activity to put them down. And the third of their marks is that they are incessant trackers, and what that means is that they will track an opponent once they have been assigned that being, and they will pursue them relentlessly, and anytime they fail a check, they will just begin a spiraling practice and walk in a circle until they rediscover tracks. Even if the tracks lead them in the wrong direction, they then find another source and pursue until they find their victim. Once they've eliminated their victim, then they return to the water. They are a specific species for the world of Nikos, and so the Walking Drowned are a great danger if you're in coastal areas and have made enemies of the captains of the Brotherhood. So there we go. We got done with the monster in a minute. So we will try to do this every day to come up with a new monster each day, drawing from the monstrous skills in the master book. And the master book is available right now at Shopify, and I'll put the link in the description down below. All right, so now we move on to the next section of today's show, which is alrighty. So when we are playing role-play games, there are times when certain people get their nose out of joint. Perhaps a ruling didn't go the way they would perceive, or perhaps they didn't get an opportunity they feel they should have, or there's simply something going on between players. And so we're going to talk today about how to handle grievance resolution in a role-playing environment. The first one that I want to mention is that there are times when these grievances explode in real time as the players either engage with one another in an angry tone, or they are engaging with the game master in disrespectful and angry tones. And the idea here is that the grievance resolution process really should have been handled in any session 0 or pre-game communication that you have with another player. That is to say, it should be very clearly outlined that poor behavior towards another human being in terms of adversarial, raising voices, expressing anger, frustration, etc., physically is a no-go. It simply has to be outlined as unacceptable from the very beginning, so that when the players are having to resolve the conflicts, they know in their minds that the worst of the cases is that somebody is not going to be able to come back to the game session. And with that being the case, then the players realize that there is a absolute line that they can cross, and that they need to be careful not to do so. The second thing that has to happen in grievance resolution is obviously the grievances need to be clearly stated. Just because somebody does something you don't like doesn't mean that you have the grounds to support a grievance or call for the player to be ousted or anything like that. Instead, it needs to be openly and communicatively discussed between the players. And if it's particularly a player versus player situation, it needs to be resolved outside of game time, outside of the game's location, and without the interaction of other players, so that there is no cause for players to feel like they're being drawn and divided into subsects or groups by the people that are the ones engaged in the conflict that is causing the grievance. That in itself seems like it might be fairly unsurmountable, but the real issue is that the players have to really want to play, and if they're wanting to play, then why is a grievance really a big matter? Now, there can be call for a player to reconsider, or a game master to reconsider a game-made decision. This can be, of course, bolstered by multiple players supporting the initiative and requiring for the game master to change his mind and alter his course. But this generally is a process whereby the communication between the members of the community are really critical. So make sure that in such a situation that the proper protocols are managed in terms of being polite to one another and acting as if each other are friends, because the point of this is that if you're playing a game together, you should be at least able to be friends with one another to the point of handling your conflicts as grown-up adult beings and not foster ill intent over long term. The other point to make about grievance resolution is that there are sometimes, and it's rare, but there are those occasions when it's simply the best for the players and the game master to call a stop to the action, a halt in the scenes, a ceasefire, if you will, and to resolve these conflicts in an open environment, even if it takes game time sessions, so that they don't continue to crop up and add problems over time. Now, another point is that when we're talking about running a game for other players and developing a story that has to be suitable to all participants, the issue of self-regulation comes up. And this is important when you're running a game and playing with a group of people that have a mixture of different cultures and backgrounds and ages and orientations and sexes and even in particular ages, especially when you're talking about youngsters. And the idea here is that self-regulation is a must for both the game master and the players to maintain a civil tongue in their head, so to speak, when participating with these younger folks and in particular those that are considered to be minors. If the games group does support and allow that, then the entire table needs to be regulated and maintained as a rational and coherent group with an eye towards making the environment accommodating for all players. Now, this process of self-regulation, it not only includes vocabulary and perhaps themes, but it also has to do with the actual mechanics of the game, so that the simplicity or the difficulty or the complexity of the story matches the players that are at the table. For example, if you have one or two younger people in your games group, then the stories and the puzzles need to be such that the players at that age bracket can be at least a part of the solution and not be overshadowed simply because they don't have the age and experience. Sometimes that might feel like there's a dumbing down of the game session, but the argument is that a younger player base also builds a new, larger audience in the future, and that's always a good thing. So the idea, therefore, of self-regulation is actually about self-preservation for the hobby, because we certainly want to have tables in the future for people to play role-playing games. And I need to ask what you think about these topics. Am I hitting on the all cylinders, so to speak? Am I providing information that's useful to you? And if there's any topics you would like me to cover that I haven't yet, make sure you mention down below. And while we're at that, make sure you hit all the buttons down below so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience. And I will see you again next time.